There's been a lot of talk lately online about the Commodore Vic-20. I've heard a lot of excellent podcasts covering its history. So I wanted to give my history about the Vic-20. It was the very first computer I had. My parents bought it for me. But to go back a little further, the first computers I ever saw were in my junior high class. It was 7th grade, just got out of 6th grade, went into 7th grade. And my science teacher, Mr. Richardson, started the very first computer lab at my junior high. And I remember he received, I think it was 3 computers. One was an Apple II. One was a Coco, a color TRS-80 color computer. I don't remember exactly which model number. And then there was a TRS-80 Model 3. And these were the very first computers I ever saw. And I don't know what came over me, but I begged and pleaded with my science teacher to help set up the lab. And I told him I'd stay after school. I told him I'd stay in on lunch break. And this was 7th grade, so that would have been 1983, I think. Somewhere right around there. And so he said yes, and I set up the lab. And I remember unpacking these computers, and they were put into a tiny closet. I guess it wasn't tiny. It was, but it wasn't a full-size room. It was in the back of the science room, and there was very little space. There was enough for a desk where we set them up, and then just enough room for students 3 at a time to sit on each computer. And it was just a watershed moment for me. I spent every minute that I could on those computers, whether it was some lunch breaks. Since I was kind of the guy that set up the lab, he allowed me to help train other kids on the computers, which these were the first ones I'd ever seen. So I spent a lot of time reading through the manuals and learning these systems. Well, anyhow, news of this lab, of course, got back to my parents through me. I would come home and I would tell them all about it. And I wasn't really that aware of home computers. These were relatively new to me. So I remember going to Toys R Us and a couple other stores like Montgomery Ward's and places like that. And we saw Commodore Vic-20s, and they were the lowest cost computer. And I would just drool over this computer at the stores. And my parents didn't have a lot of money. My dad was in the military, my mom didn't work, so money was just really tight. And so I never expected to have one, but I think through the constant talk about it and the interest that my parents saw in me, one Christmas, boom, I got a Commodore Vic-20. I remember distinctly opening it and just being floored and so happy. Now, we had a small TV in our family room that was used when our main color TV was being used. This was a very small, I couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 inches or something like that. It was a small black and white TV. And so I convinced my parents to let me take that into my room, and I hooked up the Vic-20, and that was my first computer, was the Vic-20 and the small black and white TV hooked through the RF, and no storage of any kind. I didn't have a cassette tape yet. I didn't have a disc drive, of course. I never had a disc drive, the 1541 disc drive with my VIC-20. I did get one eventually later when I got a Commodore 64, but I didn't have anything. But I did start buying magazines off the shelf. There was Compute's Gazette and Run magazine. Those were the two magazines I remember. And I would type in games out of that. And I remember the very first game I typed in was called Looper. And my best friend came over and we took turns. One of us would read the code and the other one would type it in. And eventually we typed in Looper. I'm pretty sure it was basic. And we typed it in and ran it. And since we didn't have a way to save, whenever we would turn off the computer, anything we typed in would be erased. So I remember right after we finished that, we must have left that VIC-20 on for 2 weeks straight. And he would come over after school and we would play that game every day. So eventually, through mowing lawns, doing chores around the house, getting allowance, I remember buying a lot of cartridges. Looper was the first game I played, but I think the first cartridge I ever bought was Omega Race, which was an awesome game. I mean, it was for the VIC-20, the graphics were pretty incredible. Gameplay was really cool. I do remember finding some Scott Adams adventure games on sale, the text adventure games, and I'd played some text adventure games on the TRS-80 Model 3 in the junior high class, and the Apple II had a couple. So I knew what text adventures were, so I bought those and I played through those. I can't remember the names of them. One was Voodoo Castle, I think Adventure or Adventure Island or something like that. But I accumulated several cartridges. I remember Jupiter Lander, Radar Rat Race, a couple other ones. I don't remember them all. But eventually, I remember, I think it was my next birthday. So I got that on Christmas, and I remember my birthday was in April, and the next thing I asked for a cassette, the C2N data set. And I got that, and I was off and running. I was able to type in all those games out of the magazines and save them finally. And I remember inviting my friend over, and we typed Looper in again, and we saved it. And I just remember going crazy. There was like this little utility you could type in out of Compute's Gazette that was a checksum program so that you could type in the machine language games and it would do a checksum on every line, and so that if there were any errors, it would tell you immediately, hey, this line is wrong, and then you could type the line in again. And just started accumulating VIC-20 games on cassette. Like I said, I never owned a disc drive for that until after, I think, this memory is a little fuzzy, but I think that eventually with my VIC-20, I handed it down to my sister and got a Commodore 64. And I kind of remember saving half of my money for that, and then my parents buying the rest for some holiday. It might have been Christmas or something like that. And by then, a bunch of my friends had Commodore 64, so I had used them and I knew about them, and I really wanted those games that looked better, sounded better, and I knew that the Commodore 64 had a lot more memory, so I was really into that. But eventually I handed that down. I have a lot of really great memories of the VIC-20, and it was mainly learning how to program, learning how to do BASIC. I kind of learned through typing in those basic programs and tweaking them, and basically just learning the language. And the Vic, I remember the Vic reference manual, or the manual it came with, it had a lot of example type-in code, example BASIC, and just wrote a ton of things, little adventure games, little text adventure games, things like that. Just to have a really great first computer. So anyway, those are my memories of the VIC-20.